Okay, so here we are at, I didn't change that one either, part 5. Yeah, good. So now we're over here in the brand new start, the Southern Religious Innovation section of the class. We're talking about increasingly newer and newer phenomena, things that people wouldn't have thought would have been happening, although it's, as we'll see with the second topic, some of these things have been happening below the radar for some time. And the things we'll be talking about today in order are Christian homeschoolers, the increasing prevalence, and just out of curiosity, does anybody have like children who are homeschooling their own children in here? Is it for religious reasons or for other reasons? Not really. Yeah, and that's a conflate in this whole story. So we'll come to that in a moment. The other thing is the other topic for today is Southern Christian and gay. LGBT people, and we'll use gay as a umbrella term often because it's used as such inside the religious gay community as such, as a positive affirmation, who are trying to hold on and balance those identities in a sometimes hostile environment. And we'll see both how hostile it is and how supportive it can be in certain pockets. So let's get going. Christian homeschoolers. In the 9th chapter of this book, I believe it's the 9th chapter, second to last chapter, I talk about the Christian homeschooling phenomena and just how big it's gotten in the South and for what reason. And so let me read a little bit from the introduction to that section. If you sought an intimate introduction to contemporary American evangelicalism layered with Southern hospitality, it would be hard to beat the Christian homeschooling movement and a visit to one of their conventions in Nashville. Each year there are roughly 45 homeschooling conventions in the United States, concentrated in the South, the Southwest, the Midwest, and conservative bastions of the West. For Christian homeschoolers, the biggest of these conventions recently have been the Teach Them Diligently conventions offered as a ministry since 2012 by the David and Leslie Nunnery family of Greenville, South Carolina. David's the president of Worldwide Tent Makers, a missions board in Greenville dedicated to getting people to use their business skills and professions as a platform for worldwide mission and evangelism in the same way the Apostle Paul supported his gospel spreading work by making tents, according to Acts 18. The way David and Leslie tell their homeschooling story, they say their oldest was age 12, and though initially he attended a good Christian school, the Lord began to impress upon us that we needed to start homeschooling. They want to make it clear that it's, in their case, it's not simply because, I'm going to turn this up and see if we can, yeah. Push it down.
Like behind the laptop.
There we go. Big hand for John here. So they wanted to make it clear it wasn't that they couldn't afford a good Christian school. It was that maybe that they had an obligation, a religious obligation, to raise up their own children in the way of the Lord as their child's God-given teachers, following Deuteronomy. As we prayed about this option, it became clear that this was what the Lord wanted, but the decision to homeschool was not made because of superior education in our case, but for the purpose of discipleship. Now, if you wanted to attend one of these, and they do several in locations, this particular family does these Teach Them Diligently, again, a quotation from Deuteronomy. They do these, they were initially spread a little wider, but now if you can see, picture a map that is like St. Louis, Columbus, and south, with Nashville being the biggest one that they do at Opryland every year. And it's kind of unique. You go, if you've ever been to Opryland, you know that usually when you go into any particular entrance, you got to go through a fog of smoke, right? Because it's non-smoking inside and it's so big that the smokers have to go to the outdoor entrance. And it's like, you know, like old-fashioned airport sort of stuff. Not at this conference. I mean, what you will find instead coming in are like these huge families. Husband and wife and 4 or 5 children coming into one of these conventions. And there's something for everyone. So after I registered, I think I pre-registered, I picked up my tag in 2014. I went and was greeted with lots of signs and symbols of what this movement was about. And the first room I get to was a room just like any other convention. There are all these breakout rooms. There was one this size that was being led by an advocate of intelligent design. And this guy was showing one beautiful photograph after another that looked like they were right out of Animal Kingdom or Discovery Channel or National Geographic. But what he was pointing to was how incredibly unique and a biological scientist would say adapted. But what this guy was saying is the world is only a little more than 5,000 years old. So God created this particular worm and this particular butterfly to be this particular way so they could do their function in the world this way. There is no other explanation. And he was really, making this fantastic sort of closed world explanation for creationists in an alternative scientific universe. In fact, a lot of the convention is in support of a kind of young earth biblical view of the world. By young earth, I mean the earth, and all the stars is no older than 6,000 years old. And some of the folks within the movement will even fight over, 6,000 or 5,000 and change. I'm not kidding. There are books that are they're being sold in the exhibition hall that are sold by rival scientific creationists that are kind of at each other's throats. What else is typical? Well, biblical complementarity. Mom stays home. Dad's job is to be the provider. There's a lot of living simply, a lot of education in how to live with less so that your children can have more of you. There's an incredible distrust of government schools. And the next room I went to, after I basically got the deal of the the slides of pretty animals, was with a speaker by the name of Israel Wayne. And let me go ahead to the next. He had hair when I saw him. On his head. But Israel and Brooke Wayne are big time on the speaking tour. Israel Wayne is the son of a mother who, though she never graduated high school, she led him through Christian homeschooling right up through calculus. And he says, my mother didn't know any calculus, but by the point that we reached that, I knew how to educate myself. He's an evangelist for you can do this. Let me read you just a little bit of how Wayne sounds. If you sent your kids to school at 5 or 6 because you think you aren't capable of teaching to them and teaching them to read and do math, you have bought into the Matrix, right? Like the film, The Matrix. You've bought into a false sort of system. Throughout this talk and throughout the convention, there's a steady drumbeat against public schooling, though it is not called public schooling, but government schools. What's the best advertising for homeschooling? Wayne asks. Government schools. Big laugh. They just have to be who they are. More laughs. Then Israel Wayne's face changes and his tone sobers up. But the real reason to homeschool is because the Bible says to do it. That's why we homeschool. And there's, in his description of what schools often do, and public schools often do, especially to little boys who aren't ready to quite be where the little girls are in first and second grade, really hits the hearts of his audience. And you can see the men in the room, and there are probably 150 people in a room this size. It's getting really hot. And when he gets to the place where it's like public schools are meant to treat everybody the same, and a lot of the boys aren't ready for that education at the age they're told to be at that place. And you can just see the men in this room begin to warm. I almost felt like there was a certain amount of, Mom had already seen this problem and Dad came along slowly and then recognized themselves educationally in the description. I'll confess, I saw that. I mean, my father had to teach me to read. It only took 2 afternoons, but first grade was otherwise a disaster. I talked about complementarity. Let me tell you a little bit about the rest of this kind of Christian subculture. Israel Wayne's mother, when he was 10, told him, I met a young girl who I have been, who I think would make you a godly wife in due time. And her name is Brooke, and I want you to pray on it. And, you know, years later, as still very young people, they met. They never courted, they never kissed, they never held hands, nothing until their wedding day. They subsequently have 9 children of their own. And they go around and talk about this kind of lifestyle. What I hope you're getting is a sense of this is a Christian subculture. It's strong in places like Colorado Springs, Colorado. It's not just southern, but it is strong in the South as well. It's also differentially a white movement, and it features parents whose own parents had them in Christian academies, particularly in the South. Now, the Christian academies were founded in large numbers when? Yeah, you all get that. You know, rather than desegregate the public schools and continue to send your children there, and some places were more that way than others, a lot of Christian academies were founded to make sure that children went to school with their own kind, white children. Today's Christian academies are largely, not entirely, but largely open to all races, right? If you go to one of the big or not so big Christian academies that's been around for 40 or 50 years here in Davidson County, they will have black students, they'll have Asian students. It's sort of it's very Christian, but it's also multiracial, because there's something about being old school racist that isn't Christian in the eyes of the people who are running that school. But the next generation of people who are concerned about the kinds of things that their children might be exposed to at the particularly at the high school level or junior high school level, drugs, rap music, other kinds of conformity have been driving this movement. Going into the exhibit space, you'll run into things like Above Rubies. Above Rubies is based on the Proverbs 31 verse, "Who can find a virtuous woman? For her price is far above rubies." Above Rubies is a magazine that has lots of articles about how it is a woman's job and privilege to have as many children as possible. That's why you've been placed on the earth. And there are also an extraordinary number of, if there's a drumbeat of articles in these magazines, it's about vasectomy reversal, vaginal birth after cesarean. Don't listen to what your doctors told you that this is your last child. There are ways to have more children. It's all fruitful and multiply stuff. And it's all out of Franklin, Tennessee. And they're very, very serious about this and about strengthening the role of wife and motherhood. It's not political like Phyllis Schlafly. It's domestic. Domestic female Christianity. But there are other displays that nurture this culture. And three of them that stand out, and I talk about in the book, I talk about very little, are the political ones. I talk about very little this particular one, the Family Research Council, which is very much a political operation led by Tony Perkins that's operates on the political level and in terms of activating the public to stand up for family values, qua Christian values, at every stage. Another one that I could have put up there would be the Family Legal Defense Fund. And what it's like LegalZoom only for homeschooling families. And its display, and I couldn't get a picture of it for this, had all these terrible scenarios like you're only one call from a nosy neighbor away from losing your kids because they're out of school, and the truancy laws will be enforced against you and you'll never see your kids again. By not LegalZoom, but this other product, and we will come to your aid to assert your rights as parents. Very fear-based. Then there's cat and dog theology. Let me read about cat and dog theology, because this is, after having kids at home, you'd think they'd still grow up right, but they'd still turn into teenagers. And cat and dog theology is kind of based on what you do with that. It's a 4-year curriculum for teenagers, and on the back of the first year's book, it sets it all up. There's a joke about cats and dogs that conveys their differences perfectly. A dog says, "You pet me, you feed me, you shelter me, you love me, you must be God." A cat says, "You pet me, you feed me, you shelter me, you love me, I must be God." These God-given traits of cats, "you exist to serve me," and dogs, "I exist to serve you," are often similar to the theological attitudes we have in our view of God and our relationship to Him. Using the difference between cats and dogs in a light-handed manner, the authors compel us to challenge our thinking in deep and profound ways. As you are drawn toward God in the desire to reflect His glory in your life, you will worship, view missions, and pray in a whole new way. And each year's curriculum features a fictional story about two teenagers growing up in America's self-absorbed culture. Self-absorbed culture, quote unquote. And one teenager, of course, models cat behavior, one teenager models dog behavior, and students are, anybody remember Highlights? Right? Remember Goofus and Gallant? It's like theological Goofus and Gallant all over again. It's pretty enjoyable. Oh yeah, and it's not wrong. It's just pretty whimsical. And people were packed around this particular booth. Another one they were packed around, and maybe I should set it up this way. If you choose to homeschool, you're paying your taxes that would otherwise provide your children free access to public schools, whether they're everything that you need the public schools to be or not, but you're also buying curriculum and so forth. They can be pretty expensive. It can be anywhere from $900 to $3,700 per child per year, because there are people who will sell you incredibly slick stuff. But at the other end of the spectrum are the Mennonites and the Amish. I don't have any of the Amish ones. The Amish ones don't even have graphics. They're done on a Gestetner, old-fashioned mimeograph, and they're very inexpensive. The Amish and Mennonites have been in homeschooling for a long time because they were some of the very first to get a public school exemption by law in places like Pennsylvania. They have, so this is a 1 year's progressive reading example. You work through the colors to get to where you need, and you see that you start out with really big print and you get to smaller print by the end. They're not in order, they're in some kind of pleasing color order rather than actually the progressive order. Lots and lots of people were packed around the cheapest, most simple version. And if there is kind of a virtue in all this, it is at the simple end of parents really caring about teaching their children the basics of how to learn, how to read, how to figure, how to learn for themselves. The other thing you see, you remember I talked about young earth creationism. One of the things you see a lot of books about are dinosaurs. Now, any of you who've had grandchildren, or actually children for that matter, but it's intensified to the next generation, is caring about dinosaurs. All little kids, boys differentially, care about dinosaurs. They're just really interesting. And Ken Ham, and let's see, his illustrator here is a guy named Looney, have one of the hottest sellers. Ken Ham is that guy who has sometimes debated Bill Nye the Science Guy. And all you need to know about the dinosaurs from their standpoint is the 7 F's. Dinosaurs were formed by God in 6 days, just like all the rest of us. They were fearless. Okay, that's what everybody knows about dinosaurs, right? They were fallen, just like Adam and Eve. They're always killing each other. These are not oxen. These are not docile animals. And so they get what they deserve. What? They die in the flood. They are, so they have faded from view. You can't see any living ones anymore. And then their bones have been found. That's those fossils. And it is a fiction that they lived millions and millions of years ago. So when you go to a museum, it says so in the book, those dinosaurs have been put together by guesswork by scientists using bones from many different animals. So it's presented as, and we know in fact that you go and see Sue, the Tyrannosaurus, at the Natural History Museum in Chicago. There are interpolated bones, right? There's some plastic rib bones. They didn't get every rib bone. But they take that and really run with it. So, there's an alternate Christian universe for this science. And, you would have thought that Scopes might have been the end of it. No, there are people who can take this a long way. And you might think, okay, this is really a small sort of thing. Most of the folks who are homeschooling are differentially in our region. Most are white. You are more than, had it in here, let's go to the number. So, for 2012, the U.S. Department of Education did a survey in 2007 for children. That's almost a generation ago. But they discovered that white school children represented, at that point, 76.9% of the homeschool population, even though they were just 58.3% of the school-age population. For 2012, when the department used a statistical method, like the census does in between censuses to try to figure out things, they found that white children rose to 83% of the homeschooled population, even though their proportion of in the population had dropped to 52.2% of the population. So putting this another way, white children were 1.3 times as likely in 2007, the year of the Better survey, to be homeschooled as children of all other races, while black children were only about 1/4 as likely to be homeschooled as their school-age peers, with Hispanics being in the middle, half as likely, Asians being almost as likely as white children, and Pacific Islanders running about at the same rate, in part because, Pacific Islanders and others, including Eskimos and so forth. So in Alaska, in Guam, places like that, it's pretty high. What does all this amount to? Well, it amounts to, in a place like the American South, you have some young people being educated in public schools, some people being educated in religious related academies and schools. Some people, some very elite folks like my kids who went to University School in Nashville or MBA or Harpeth Hall or something, got a really fine prep education, or the equivalent in a magnet in school. And then there are these large number of kids who got homeschooled, and some of the homeschooled kids got a straight up really good scientific education because their parents cared about that. Some get a pretty odd view, And some of the folks who get an odd view can actually hide that enough so that they can become doctors someday, right? They can do the chemistry, they can do the biology, but they got their fingers crossed about some other things. What is all that going to mean over time? And we'll talk a little bit about that next week especially, but what I'm beginning to think is that these subcultures, rather than a kind of monoculture where everybody read Dick and Jane and Tom and Sally, and have as they began to read, and pledge the allegiance, and did the same kind of things, are leading us into very different camps of both knowledge and attitudes toward one another. Something a little disturbing.
So do the homeschooling culture try to avoid having the kids know about things they think are wrong?
Yeah, want to shelter their kids as long as possible.
This is an option, but we don't believe it. They don't try that road.
Yeah, no, it's not 1970s parenting. Faith is an option, and we'll let you decide if you want to follow God or something like that. No, it's and with respect to other things as well. It's strong parenting. It's maybe 19th century parenting, if you will, in terms of dad says and mom runs the home altar. We'll talk more about it in the Q&A. Which reminds me to set a clock here. Now let's talk about being Southern and Christian and gay. Here's the total number of congregations. These are all religious congregations. Overwhelmingly, these are Christian congregations. In each state, in something like Virginia, you'd have less than 100 congregations that would be synagogues, mosques, Center for Buddhist Contemplation, what have you. And Virginia is a more cosmopolitan state than probably any. Georgia would be up there too in terms of having diversity. But again, maybe 100, 150 in Georgia out of 12,292. How many of those congregations, let's take Georgia again, are gay affirming? Now by gay affirming, and a group out in San Francisco, we don't know their last names, but there are 3 people who've been tracking this by going on websites, calling up congregations for years to track congregation by congregation, where are you, so that LGBT people don't walk into hostile and toxic situations. And there is a list, gaychurch.org, of every congregation. Gay churches, gay affirming congregations run from mildly affirming, like you're all welcome, but some of us aren't in that quite place, like West End United Methodist, right? Not everybody's on board there, but the church is officially welcoming, even though the United Methodist Church as a whole is against gay marriage and ordination of gays and lesbians to the office of ordained elder or minister. So we've got that, and some of them go to really very, very affirming, and there are even some churches that are composed of principally LGBT people and their families. We'll get to that by the end. What's fascinating, to me at any rate, is Vermont, another rural state, and by no means the most progressive state in the country. I just pulled this one up because northern Appalachians, very different in other respects. 7.38% of their churches are gay affirming. That means 92+% are not. But compare that to Mississippi. Where's Mississippi? Mississippi only had, at the time, 18 congregations, all in college towns or Jackson, its biggest metropolis, 0.2%. 0.27%. So I think the number is you're 27 times likelier, just randomly, to be walking into an affirming church in Vermont than in Mississippi. Now, all things are not random. If you're walking in a metro area in the South, you have a much more likely chance to be walking into an affirming church than you are in a low population density rural area.
Is some of that due to the difference in denominations and the locations? Like in Vermont, if you're walking to church, it might be more likely to be a Unitarian or congregation?
So, a Unitarian Universalist or a UCC church. But what's interesting about that is not all the UCC churches up there are like registering themselves as that. And part of that is that there are a lot of Vermont churches. There are a lot of Vermont churches that are like Bible fellowship churches right down the street from the old brands, the Episcopal and the UU and the Congregational. So they have some, Christians are come in, open and affirming, and come in. There's some rules you got to know about before you come in, types. One thing you might not know is that some of the earliest forms and leaders of gay affirming churches were actually Southern born and started churches. Reverend Troy Perry, who founded the Metropolitan Community Church in 1968. He founded it out of the South, but he was from the Florida-Georgia line. And he represents a group, a type of people who are so thoroughly churched, right, that your life
Housekeeping to room 110. Housekeeping 110.
Okay, we'll get to that later. Who their life so revolves around church. Sunday morning, Saturday, Sunday morning, Sunday evening, youth group, choir, Wednesday evening, all the social events, all the people you see outside school, your heart, before you're aware of your own sexuality, is all about God, all about Jesus, and then you discover feelings for another person of the same sex, and everybody says, well, you're not a Christian anymore, and subjectively, somebody like Troy Perry is saying, what changed? Nothing changed for me about the way I feel about God. Nothing changed about the way I feel about Jesus. Perry creates the Metropolitan Community Church. actually a fairly, you see him wearing a collar, it's a fairly conservative church theologically, except for the extravagant sort of, all you people who've been shut out by your other churches, your Baptist churches, your Methodist churches, your Presbyterian churches, can join. Even before that, though, the Reverend George Augustine Hyde in the Atlanta area founded the American Holy Orthodox Catholic and Apostolic Eastern Church in 1957. He was a Catholic convert who was in seminary just below Atlanta, and he was a bit of a smartass. And he kept asking questions, and he asked too many questions, and they decide to kick him out in 1946. And he's going around saying goodbye to his fellow seminarians, and he gives one guy a hug, goodbye, and the seminary is sufficiently homophobic that just the hug gets him in trouble. And one of the boys in chapter says, "I want to charge George," this man, "and Carl," one of the other seminarians, "with fondling one another in an immoral manner." The accuser went on, and, "Well, I'm supposed to stand up," Hyde says, and say, "Thank you so much for bringing that to my attention. I had forgotten it, or did not place very great importance on it, and I'm sorry. But I didn't. I got up and I said, 'Listen, you little snot.' And I walked down and I addressed the Father Superior and all the priests and all the students, and one of them later called it my Martin Luther speech. And I said, 'You have distorted Christ's message, and you have gone far outside the legislations of Christ and imposed upon your own legislation, and you, with a twisted mind and a twisted morality, you say the simple things of expressing your feelings or friendship for another person is sinful. There's nothing sinful about two men embracing one another, but you've made it so. And you've accused me of this and that and the other, but you are building in every corner of the church closets in which to shut away those who have a moral standard different from yours.'" It goes on and on. It is a Martin Luther kind of moment. He goes back to Atlanta, to the Cathedral Church, to the bishop who'd sent him to seminary, and he finds that there's a young man who was barred by the priest, who, after expressing homosexual tendencies in confession, the priest says, "Well, you can't have communion." And they decide, well, I'm in good with the bishop, even though I got kicked out of seminary. We'll go together. They go to communion, and the bishop refuses to serve either of them. I'm sorry, not the bishop, the priest. They decide they'll get a bigger group of people, of do-gooders, to surround this young man. They're all denied communion. This gets him mad enough that he begins to explore founding a different kind of Catholic church, and a Greek Orthodox priest ordains him. Pretty soon, he's doing church in one of the hotels downtown that has a gay bar. And pretty soon word is out, and they've got 200 people a week coming to a Greek Orthodox church in the late 1940s in Atlanta. For me, it illustrates pretty well how strong the religious impulse is alongside every other impulse. And if the story in people's minds is, well, you can be gay or Christian, that's not the way it's seen inside. And I'd like to talk about some books I draw from that are wonderful additional reads. The first is Bernadette Barton's Pray the Gay Away. This is an actual church. She didn't have to go and set the letters up herself. There's all these sorts of kind of you're Christian or you're gay. You can't be both erosive messages. She's a professor in a rural town, and she writes about the extraordinary lives of Bible Belt gays, that is, gay and lesbian people, and the kinds of lives they have to live, including sometimes being in what she calls the toxic closet. How does the toxic closet work? Well, let me tell you about the experience of Missy. Missy talks about going with her family to a church where homosexuals are a despised group and singled out for preaching for disapprobation. She says, "This for me is a major way religion and my family colluded to keep me or anyone in the toxic closet. You see your whole immediate family not agreeing so much, like they are sitting and nodding their heads as the preacher speaks. But you see them in no way disagreeing. They listen intently, shake the preacher's hand on the way out with a smile, and the belief system has been reinforced." Misty clearly knew at the end of the church service, I say, what the looking glass of the church thought of her. And even if her family knew about or suspected her difference in sexuality, they played along with the preacher and thereby increased her sense of alienation. So that's the toxic closet, in which you want to stay part of your family, you want to go to church with them because you've always been going to church, and then what you hear at church makes you hate yourself. Like you're looking in a mirror, but you're seeing that the distortions of the mirror that the preacher is creating through words of hate. And increasingly, in the South and other places, a lot of how the difference between Christian and non-Christians are refracted is along sexuality lines. A good part of the South, as you know, and Southern church culture is black. And E. Patrick Johnson has written two terrific oral history books. One just came out on black queer Southern women. I don't cover that in the book, but it's wonderful in its own way. Sweet Tea, Black Gay Men of the South, talks a lot about religion. He didn't set out to write about religion, but the individual lives of the people he interviews keeps expressing religion. One thing that keeps coming up again and again is, why are there so many gay men in the black church choir? And the answer he gets is, it's because it's a place where they know or sort of know who and what you are, and they want your voice, and they love you for that part of you, as long as you don't ask too much more. But then you got to listen to the preaching that makes you feel bad. But the choir, it's a back and forth. The other part is, the other common story is having Jesus in my heart as a strategy. I don't go to church anymore, but I take church with me. So an extraordinary number of people, there's a man who goes by the moniker First Lady. So this is a guy who is performing his identity almost as a pastor's wife, the First Lady of the church, out in the community. And he does what a pastor's wife does. He prays with people. He hangs out in the bar and listens to their woes and troubles. It's quite a story. And my underlying point here is that you can kick LGBT people out of your church, but it's not so easy to take the church out of, nor do they want to resign the spiritual part of themselves. Let's go towards some happier stories, in a way. Let me tell you about two churches in the Nashville area. First is Ed Sanders and the Whosoever church called Metropolitan Interdenominational Church, which is radically inclusive. He had been the chaplain at Fisk University, and they got a new president who didn't like the fact that the Sunday morning chapel was so popular. It was a kind of cult of personality thing, and there was only room for one big cheese on the Fisk campus. And so Ed Sanders, a graduate of Yale Divinity School, was sort of forced out. He spends a few months thinking about what he's going to do next. A lot of people who had attended worship said, "Why don't you start a church?" He says, "I don't want to start just another black church here in Nashville. If we're going to do one, we're going to do one bigger and different." Well, what would you call it? Well, I'd call it Metropolitan because it's as big as Davidson County, interdenominational because everybody would be welcome, and church, obviously. And one of the people he was conspiring with, one of the 12 people who gets it going, says, "You know, that Metropolitan is what they call the gay church." And he says, "Well, that's okay. They can come." What he didn't realize was that one of the 12 initial people was on the down low, a gay man who came down with AIDS. They didn't even know it was HIV/AIDS. He got toxoplasmosis, you know, the thing that initially cats got, right? And it was like, how's he got that? He doesn't even have cats. Little by little, they surrounded him. No other black church was doing that. And sometimes the things you do with your heart attract other people. So pretty soon, they had sex workers, other people suffering with AIDS. It became their ministry. This is from their website. Their values are embracing, welcoming, accepting. We practice radical inclusion by offering everyone the experience of unconditional love. Embracing, we openly embrace relationships with all people. Welcoming, we welcome whosoever. Now, whosoever comes from John 3:16. It's not the part of John 3:16 that you think of as on baseball caps or signs at Braves meeting. It's like whosoever, anybody can come to Jesus. We lovingly accept all people. And then Also there is, Jesus having table fellowship with tax collectors and sinners, and it's okay. There's a remarkable church fellowship in North Nashville. They also have raised millions and do the First Response Center downtown. Also north of town in Madison is a different kind of affirming church. Reverend Greg Bullard grew up Baptist. He experienced his own kind of toxic closet experience, but he didn't leave it there. And what you would experience at Covenant of the Cross, an old General Cinema theater, back when movie theaters were a big deal, when they showed two different movies. It's been completely gutted and refitted as a very nice church building. But they draw people from out on the plateau, Cookeville and Crossville, over to Dixon, down to the Alabama border, up beyond the Kentucky border, who come to a congregation of about 300 people where they can worship with their families, where you have men with men, women with women, a lot of grandparents and children worshiping with these family members, so that actually, if you count the kids and do the average, it's probably a majority cisgendered heterosexual congregation, but they're there with people who they love, and it's Baptist in every other way except that guilt stuff isn't there. Faith doesn't, from a sermon, Bullard, here are some excerpts. Faith doesn't make everything okay. Faith makes it possible to get through anything. You are not the sin you committed. If you're trying to rebuild people's self-esteem, speaking the truth in love matters. Christianity 101, but with an emphasis of rebuilding the unbuilt selves of a lot of people who've been through this toxic closet experience. God is about making you a better person. If it's just about getting saved, you might as well get shot so you can go to heaven. But God is about making you a better person through sanctification in this world. Be changed by the renewing of your mind. Paul. Paul gets preached as a very positive message, rather than the scold with the ruler in Bullard's sermons. They have the same hill songs, that is the projected songs out of Australia that are really catchy and all that you would find at other evangelical New Style churches. Yeah.
What's your feeling about gays? That they can be changed, or?
No, that they don't need to be changed. That's how God created them. So this is, Greg Bullard is the guy with hair. His husband is without. They have two adopted children. And the kids are just like other pastors' children, and husband often, or when I've gone functions, like any other parent, holding the child as best they can until one of them wants to break loose and go stand up on the stage with daddy. All of this models, a kind of radically different kind of Christianity from what you would find at equally Baptist-style church. This could not be more Baptist, but for this other. So this is not just sort of gay affirming. This is like both feet. into it. And the day I went, I think I put this in the book. The day I went, the people I'm sitting with turn to me and say, the woman says, "How is your son?" I said, Says, "Yeah, I was a nurse at Vanderbilt ASAP, a nurse practitioner, and you and your son came in." I said, "I'm so sorry, I didn't recognize you, and let me introduce you to my family and so forth and so on." Just church, right? Get our heads around that. Well, I've run over in the book. I talk about the multivalent sort of responses to the Pulse nightclub shooting in Orlando. And here's a policeman looking at the way that religion operated with makeshift, on-the-spot memorials. These are outside the nightclub. Billy Graham organization sent down pastoral counselors. And they didn't, unlike Franklin Graham, who made all kinds of nasty comments, the Billy Graham Center was there in an extraordinarily pastoral way. They got pictures of every single person within 24 hours and set up a chapel for people. The church right 2 doors down, all they would do was set up a respite ministry for first responders, right? Not for victims or victims' families, first responders. And I want to end with this one. And you can see Matthew Vines on the PDF I've posted or sent to Chandra that'll be available on the site. This is a funeral at the Cathedral Church of St. Luke, the Episcopal Church. It's pretty remarkable. It's packed out, and this young man is 31 years old. He's a former church member, son of the church. He's being buried out of the church. What's remarkable about it is just a year earlier, 2 gay church members had been refused baptism for their son. And then the bishop felt horrible about it and had a change of heart. And felt so horrible about the experience he'd had of turning down baptism that a year later, this church knew exactly what to do. It's how change happens. I'll stop there and take a few questions. Yeah.
I was in a Methodist congregation in Franklin a couple of years ago. We were having a listening session about the decision on whether to accept gays or not. It was interesting that we actually have a gay couple in our church, and they were part of it, and the acceptance there was very much along the lines, and I think it helped that we had a gay couple attend there for a number of years. They had 2 boys, and on one committee, they're just people. And I think that's what helps change, is just being around a gay couple. They would see them bring their parents, and it was just nice to see them be able to come to church and just be in church.
Yeah, the Human Rights Commission, you'll see the yellow equal sign on a purple background, has this phrase, the power of one. And it really especially works in the South and will continue to work as a erasure. The power of one means if you know one person, you will feel differently about the issue, because it's very hard to hate or objectify a whole group of people once you know one person that you care about. So once you discover people in your orbit, and this is the thing that's changing rather quickly. Our workplaces are likely to be more, workplaces, families, extended families are currently more likely to be a little more accepting than some of our congregations are as a whole in the South.
It was interesting, they said, and I talked to one of them, I was on committee with them, he said, we don't be treated any different than anybody else, we just want to be part of the congregation, which I thought was a very telling that we, how we should, address that issue.
Yeah, yeah.
I had a similar experience probably 15 years ago. I go to Christ Church Cathedral once in a while. And we were discussing then the issues that were facing the Episcopal Church about gay marriage and or ordination. Well, the ordination came up before gay marriage did as an issue. And it was a Sunday school class and well attended. And about halfway through the class, one of our respected male members got up and announced to the public for the first time that he was gay. That really broke the ice. From that point on, our congregation became very accepting because this guy was very well accepted in the community, and it made all the difference in the world for him to come forth, and it took an act of courage on his part to do that.
Yeah, and it probably took a certain amount of, he believed this was a place that was at least halfway towards a trusting, safe place to announce that. There are other examples where people kind of, I'm Presbyterian and we have general assemblies, and on occasion on particular issues somebody will set themselves on fire to try to, a Joan of Arc moment to try to get change to happen. And while it happens years later, it usually doesn't happen for them right then and there because it doesn't have the prior relationship in place. And it may be harder to come out in Centerville and Dixon and Crossville and Franklin, Kentucky than it is to come out in some other places, which explains why people drive 2 hours to go to this church in a old strip mall.
Where is this St. Luke's?
St. Luke's is the Cathedral Church of the Episcopal Church in Orlando, Florida. And, they knew how to jump right in and do some, be a cathedral church. Some of the megachurch pastors actually did some extraordinary things. And the church that probably, because of course it was a mostly Hispanic, Latino and Latina set of victims, the church that actually connected most was a Pentecostal affirming church on the north side of Orlando, who got in there and hosted families who were finding out that their child was gay or lesbian through finding out where they were that night, which is all kinds of horrible and revelatory stuff all in one. Okay, what else?
I've been recently involved in at the legislature, at the hearings for the legislature on the issues of LGBTQ and adoption, LGBTQ bathrooms in the schools. And the legislature here in Tennessee is very much against the inclusion in these situations. And we made an appearance. We were all wearing red shirts, and we were asked to just sit there in the hearing room and make our presence known by our red shirts. And still, it didn't work. work, it didn't help. But in the fall, or next legislative session, it'll probably come up again. And so if anyone wants to add their bodies to this protest, or an effort to have more inclusive places, parks, then they could get involved with the Tennessee Ecology Project.
Yeah. So, that it is. If we bring these sort of two chapters and topics together, it is very interesting to me how we live in a political and community ethos in which individual people and their needs and humanity is set aside. Large-scale conception of family values and heteronormative or even Christian ideals of old-fashioned Christian ideals of what it makes for a family that are being promoted at a state level, and you can make real hay as a legislator in some of our states, not just southern states. You can do it in Iowa too, by grandstanding on a particular issue about all LGBT people and how horrible they are. But the flip side is, allies of people who know people can put a stick in the spokes of the bicycle of power. And sometimes courageous governors can do that. We'll talk more about that, more about how all these pieces fit together and the prospects for how it'll unfold in the future next week. Time's up. Thanks.